How's your mic?
I think I'm functioning.
Okay, how do we start?
How do we get to the bottom of this?
Well, it's actually funny because when I was watching the video, the first thing that I thought about was not necessarily just what we talked about, but about white supremacy, thinking about white supremacy, which is obviously the main theme of the exhibition. What I was thinking about as well was kind of deliberate misunderstanding, which I thought was really cool. Cool in a bad way, but like thinking about how interesting it was. But just seeing the methodologies that people use to essentially troll. And then there's that quote always that talks about blackness and saying the black experience is the constant feeling of like having your time wasted in many ways. And I thought it was interesting to see that enacted in a way that I had experienced online or just in conversation with people. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the term sea lioning.
Sea lining?
Yeah.
No, I haven't.
There's this really interesting comic that basically makes the joke that this person says, oh, I hate sea lions. And then this person keeps asking, the sea lion arrives and keeps asking them incessant, really annoying, but very politely worded questions, basically trying to like tire the person into submission. Can you tell me a little bit more about like how you try to represent that in the exhibition, in the video?
It's a really good question because I think it taps into, for me, what was one of the questions that recurred for me in a sort of anxious, paranoid way as I was shooting and making the piece, which has to do with the way a piece like this, at this moment in time that we're living through, inevitably splits your audience into people who identify as white and people who've been subject to whiteness and have to deal with the aggressions that come with whiteness. And so I've obsessed a lot about, whether this is a piece, at the risk of generalizing. Obviously, we can't assume that all white people will respond in the same way or all people of color will. But been very interested in trying to think about what a piece like this could offer to those two different audiences. And I don't think that I could have the answer to that question when it comes to audiences of color. But one of the things that's occurred to me is that one of the operating principles of whiteness as it is imposed on people who are not white is gaslighting, whereby one encounters a racist moment and is then told immediately, oh, you're oversensitive. Oh, that's not how I meant it. Oh, but you're being too harsh. That's just how he is. That, don't. And I think that there's something about a lot of the content that's embedded in the work, which interestingly is systemic for white supremacy, in the sense that it's carried into the world by individuals who often think that when they're saying these things, that these things are actually their thought, that they're saying for the first time to the person in front of them, I'm not a racist, some of my best friends are black, as if this person of color has never heard this comment before. And I was interested in whether the kind of accumulation and aggregation of this kind of daily racist lingo could add up to something which then becomes really undeniable through its density, because usually it's kind of distributed in a kind of, harder to pin down.
I think that the line that kind of made it all succinct for me was, well, what's wrong with being proud? Because it's always said out of context and purposefully ignoring the context. And I think that's the kind of operative thing, right? It's like you have a clear understanding of the context and the history, but you're intentionally misunderstanding in order to frustrate people into submission so they'll no longer want to argue with you. Exactly. And that or worse, that they'll come across as unreasonable by reacting to the feeling of frustration. And you can say, okay, I'm not arguing with a reasonable person, so then I don't have to engage with these ideas anymore. And I thought that the kind of repetitive, also the kind of insertion of time constantly was a very clear feeling of that feeling of being frustrated. With the TikTok sounds, what were you intending?
The TikTok, I hoped would serve two purposes. On the one hand, the TikTok, I wanted people to sort of be alerted to the fact that what I'm thinking about is not simply racism in the way that it manifests, but the ways in which our reception of this kind of discourse through social media, through the media in general, is often how we absorb it and how we develop our own opinions. And TikTok as a medium, as a social media platform, I think has become one of the major spaces, formative spaces for people when they're trying to figure out where they kind of fit in the political spectrum. Conveniently for me, TikTok also has a lot of videos on it where people are lip syncing to voices which are not their own. But the TikTok really on a larger level for me was about an internal clock which a lot of white people seem to be harboring and have been harboring for a long time. When you look across different white dominant cultures where people are looking back at long sort of legacies of racism and where they're now being challenged more directly than they ever have been, although of course legacies of anti-racism are long, but I think we have all observed that in the last few years there's been a certain sort of coming to a head in terms of addressing what's been there for a very long time. And I'm very interested in a very particular white delusion around white extinction. So whether you're tapping into the American context, the German context, the South African context, there's this shared notion that white people are going to go extinct, and I think it's a response, a very obvious response to a loss of privilege, and this sense that if one can't retain that privilege, it's almost like dying, which I think is quite interesting considering that the many people who have never had access to the privileges and entitlements. Exactly. So I wanted to tap into that kind of particular delusion about, oh my God, we're going to go extinct. The gays and the migrants and the queers and the feminists and the black people are removing us and there's no space for us anymore. And it is a very dark thing. On the one hand, it's possible to laugh at it. I mean, after all, what with climate change, we're all basically going to go extinct together. But trust white people to cook up a mythology whereby they're going to go extinct first, right? And so I was interested in having the piece carry that kind of, that TikTok. I think there are two ways of reading it. If you still identify with whiteness, which I need to say obviously is distinct from white people, in the same way that patriarchy is distinct from men as a category, I have to say that the distinction isn't always a wide one, but you know what I mean. So I wanted the piece to carry, at a certain point, it reaches a moment where the discussion really is about demographics and about a fear around going extinct. In this country, that manifests, before 1994, there was this idea amongst many white South Africans that if we give them their freedom, they will kill us. And I think we have similar things now today with the farm murders, this notion that every white farmer is dying, which becomes a propaganda call, which gets reiterated by people like Trump. But in the American alt-right, in the German alt-right, this fear of being replaced.
Yeah, it's also interesting because in the context of watching the film, I was partly struck by that generation, but also struck by my own generation and the propaganda and the strong belief that has happened. And I was telling you, as a person who's been online on Reddit and all of those things, going down these wormholes or seeing particular phrases constantly used. So a kid in rural freaking America in Idaho somewhere would be telling me about how explosive the political situation is in South Africa and how it's going to go the way of Zimbabwe. And I was just like, how does this person even know these talking points? And why am I being besieged by the same people kind of saying the same things over and over again? And it's kind of the idea of this person acting as if this is a very novel idea and the first time you've ever heard this thing. But it felt so coordinated. And then going down the rabbit hole and finding, there's a white supremacist website called Stormfront, and they've kind of repackaged it in a way that's very cute and very modern and has very digitally native methodologies of spreading that propaganda. And it's also interesting talking about TikTok as well, because there is also, I find that this is kind of what's fascinating to me about the algorithm. You're kind of constantly being tested for your political views at every moment. So the minute you look at something for a little too long, they're like, oh, we know what you like. And they're testing you and testing you over and over again. And so that they can shove you into this corner and basically continue to indoctrinate you with this information. So the minute somebody kind of has their ears pricked and goes, what's this about? Checks the comment section, looks at that video for a second longer, this suddenly becomes their whole world. It's like an incredible kind of propaganda mechanism. And I thought that that was really interesting in the way that it's framed in the video.
And I think what's interesting about that kind of algorithmic propaganda is that it really just is an exaggeration and intensification of what happens socially anyway. For as long as we remain in bubbles which nurture particular values or beliefs, it's fairly likely that we're going to perpetuate and fall into that same set of beliefs. And then the moment that you leave the bubble, you're challenged by other people's views. But it's interesting how dominant the media has become in assigning to us our position within the political spectrum and unfortunately polarizing us very, very extremely.
I guess that's TV media has become its own crazy bubble in its own sense. But I think there was something to be said about being confronted with information that you didn't necessarily choose and that wasn't intentionally selected for you.
Sure.
And now people could never escape their bubble and they would never even know that they were in a bubble. I think that's kind of fascinating, and it's like kind of sophistication in a sense. And also this kind of the way that it's able to wrap itself up in this, like, we're just giving people what they want to know. We're giving the people the information that they want to know. This is information that they're demanding based on their previous likes. But actually they're kind of capturing them. And I think we kind of spoke about the recent extremist attacks from like young people in America and in New Zealand, I think. But also like referencing just like contexts that have nothing to do and are on the other side of the world. And then also, we did speak about the idea of like a global whiteness, right? Like thinking, if you talk about like Black consciousness, we say that that supersedes national boundaries and that there's a shared experience that's happened to all of us. And then you almost have to think that there's the opposite, right? There's the alternative, a kind of global whiteness where a person in America can say, oh, but look at the refugees in Germany. That means that we're all under attack. We're all, as a kind of community, under attack. And I think you kind of pointed that out in the video, especially where it was this simultaneous desire to be treated and seen as an individual, but also kind of protect your group, your kind of in-group. I thought that was really, the hypocrisy of it is just kind of fascinating.
Well, I think that again brings us back to the role that the internet plays in kind of aggravating or exaggerating phenomena which were already present. So what one starts to realize if you spend time in right-wing conversation forums online is that there's a huge amount of contact between the far right in South Africa and Germany and America and Britain, which allows for this kind of fermentation of a global whiteness. And interestingly, although the histories are, of course, radically different and particular to each of these geographical contexts, the dominant ideas which underpin white supremacy and which make it possible for whiteness to sort of maintain its hold are remarkably similar from one context to another. And I think that, you know, when you talk about this anxiety around the individual, what I find so interesting about the defensiveness which gets performed in the piece is that the objections are so often really just an inversion of what people of color have experienced forever. So this idea of not being seen as an individual, of course these are exactly the operations of racism. And I think that we need to talk a little bit about the ways in which often within white conversations, there's an assumption that the terms of a conversation can simply be reversed or inverted and remain accurate. So the reverse racism assumes that there are not dynamics of power that are asymmetrical. It assumes that you can just flip things. And I think that's the gamble that I was taking with calling the piece Whiteface and seeking to work with Whiteface. I wanted to, I suppose, think about the ways in which blackface as an obvious kind of medium of humiliation, of denigration, of dehumanization, when you flip it, and start to use a kind of performance, the theatrical performance of race, when the racial construct that's under the microscope is whiteness, does it do the same thing, or is this a punching up instead of a punching down? You know?
I guess that goes back to the kind of the central condition of the video piece, which is that whiteness is always perceived as the norm, and kind of the base level that we're all existing in, and everything else is abnormal, and so to be treated as abnormal is like an alien experience, and that's the kind of experience that everyone else has to deal with. Again, kind of like turning it on its head, but it's, yeah, I find especially that kind of the costumes as well, the aesthetics of it, it's, I guess this is also tricky, and it speaks to what you were talking about a particular audience, because funny enough, I was watching it in the video room, which is a very different experience to watching it at home. And without wanting to call anyone out, I was sitting in the video room with somebody, and he was finding it very amusing and was like laughing, and then kind of had like a moment. And I was like, fascinating. Because to me, it felt obvious that it was satirizing whiteness, but then I was like, okay, there's a possibility of a person who watches this and
feeling affirmed.
And there's also kind of the possibility, because there's the existing trope of like the white devil, right? And then there's like the kind of the monster that's white. That exists in popular culture. And so there's the potential of this person being like, oh, see, they're making fun of how they try to make us look like monsters. And then I thought, okay, you can't really account for that. I mean, how did you try to kind of navigate that potential?
Well, of course, that's the risk that the piece takes, and it's certainly not for me to judge whether I managed to, negotiate that balance in the right way. But there was a delicacy around not wanting to devolve into something that was too theatrical. Of course, I could have slapped white makeup on. I could have gone down the blackface road and been more grotesque. But it seemed to me that what I needed to do was to apply enough exaggeration and enough alienation to the characters so that they could no longer be easily identified with. What I was trying to do really was to break the empathy with the content and with the characters. And I think that really is a question for people experiencing the work, whether that works or not. Is it still possible to identify with the content or not? I mean, I've been gratified by responses of people who sort of come out sort of saying things like, oh shit, I say that all the time and now I'm really uncomfortable. But of course, the people who feel affirmed by the piece don't generally come and speak to me about it.
But also the fact that there's, like we kind of talked about the fact that there's kind of an unlimited propensity to like deliberately misunderstand something,
yes.
Right? And that's, I guess that's the thing, right? How you can't communicate with people who are intentionally obtuse and who will intentionally try to like twist something in order to work in their favor, which is essentially kind of the world that we're existing in and the way the debate happens.
Yeah, but I don't think that invalidates your question. I think it's a really important question. Does the piece take sufficient distance from the object of its observation?
But then I guess also, as being a white person, you can't completely create distance because it's something. I was talking to somebody earlier and they were saying like, whoa, this is kind of abrasive or whatever. And it was a friend who's a person of color. And I was saying, okay, but we constantly have these conversations. We're talking about video makers and photographers, and they're constantly trying to document the Black experience or to talk to the Black experience in some way. And we get incredibly frustrated with those people. And we say, why don't you talk about your own experience? And to me, that was like, that's basically the full reason that I was like, I want to have this conversation with you. Because I'm like, that's amazing. Talk about the white experience. Talk about whiteness as something to be talked about, right? And not something that's a natural state of being and all of us as the outsiders. Like, creating an othering about whiteness and like investigating what that means. What is whiteness? Yeah.
Well, you're really hitting the nail on the head in terms of my starting point and where I was coming from at the beginning. We often hear allies, people of color, saying that if we're going to do the very hard and slow work of dismantling whiteness, which means dismantling white supremacy, this really can't be labor that falls on the shoulders of black people or people of color. They've had to do enough work as a result of these structures. So it really needs to be white people who lead the effort to question and interrogate and slowly break down whiteness. And whiteness is such a slippery thing because it really has managed to perpetuate itself by pretending to be invisible, by pretending not to be a racial experience, as you've said. So on the one hand, I think that it's necessary to visibilize whiteness, to point out that this too is a race that we need to be speaking about as the other side of the coin. But on the other hand, in visibilizing it, there is the inevitable risk of recentering it and offering it too much space. And that's, I think, the very tricky territory that the work occupies. But how do we speak about whiteness without finding a visual language and a form in which to...
And almost not worrying that it's going to be recentered because whiteness is always centered, right? That's the kind of general experience that we all live in. That's the center of every experience. And I also said to this friend, and you know, because we're talking about who this work was made for, right? And in my mind, I looked at it and I was like, it's not necessarily made for me. I can watch it and I can laugh and kind of think, oh, I've seen that kind of person before. But ultimately, it's white people to be able to look at themselves in a way that they might not necessarily have done before. And it just reminded me of something really funny I saw on TikTok, which was that there's like some beautiful supermodel type that's on there. Somebody made a TikTok saying, oh, you know, we all want to look like Alex R. And then a bunch of people of color were just like, who the hell is Alex R? We don't know this person. Like, we don't want to look like her. We don't know anything about her. But just this assumption that like the whole "this is water" thing, right? Like this is, and so to make something, especially because, you know, we go into galleries every day and we see artworks that are, in one way or another, if not intentionally, created for white people to look at and understand, right? And to me, this is not something that's new that's being done. It's more that you're doing it in a way that's deliberate and acknowledging that you're making something that's supposed to have a clear message. But it doesn't. It's not out of the experience, right? And even in centering whiteness, that's not an alien experience to us.
Yeah. But in a way, that was a very helpful realization for me when I was already quite deep into the process, because I was very, very concerned about whether reproducing this content could extend the violence and could just be in some ways re-traumatizing. And in casual conversations with friends who are subject to racism, you know, I had more than one person say to me along the way, we deal with this shit every day, all the time, non-stop. You're definitely not like introducing us to anything that we don't know or have to negotiate on a constant basis. And so that really comes back to that question, what kind of laughter is it that one laughs in front of this piece, depending on where you're coming from and depending on what your experience of white supremacy is, which side of the...
And I guess that's the nature of a joke, right? You can't control why the person is laughing.
Exactly.
Just hope to kind of...
I mean, you can't control, ultimately, obviously, the reading of a work, but I think that as an artist, you have a responsibility to try and work against misreadings which would take people who are experiencing the work so far away from what you're interested in that it would no longer be meaningful for you.
You did also kind of mention to you that it was kind of a weird kind of navigation as a person who's left South Africa and is now living in Europe. Can you kind of speak about what that felt like? Kind of how did you get to this idea and, you know, kind of navigating the awkwardness around that?
Well, I suppose that, you know, I have over the last 30 years tried a few times to engage with this thing, whiteness. And it's, at the beginning, my content and my approach was far more South African and far more specific to South African references. But the truth of the matter is that I've been living outside of the country for a really long time now. I haven't worked out lately how long, but a long time, you know, over 25 years. And so I've become more and more interested in comparing and thinking about my experiences of white supremacy, obviously as a as a benefactor of white supremacy in this country, living in the US for 10 years, living in Germany for 20 years, very interested in how these things are connected to each other. Apartheid was very inspired by Nazi ideology, and we have, for example, monuments like the Voortrekker Monument, which literally grows out of the plans of a Nazi architect. So I think that when you're living in a specific culture, you necessarily focus on the way that these dynamics are operative in that culture. But when you have the privilege of experiencing different contexts, you start to connect the dots. And in the case of this piece in particular, I thought that the media space would be a good starting point, but also I was particularly interested in the space of British Empire. And so you'll notice that all of the voices in the work are voices that grow out of the British Empire. There's a lot of American voices. The media landscape is, of course, dominated by American media. There are Canadian voices, New Zealand, Australian, a couple of South African voices. And I decided that rather than having this piece address a specific context, I wanted to look at this global whiteness and how it kind of leaks from one place into another, not only laterally in the contemporary moment, but also, through the depth of history and how one generation inherits and warps and mutates and refines and perpetuates ideas of the last generation. So I think I've lost your question a little bit, but I guess that the last time that I felt the works on that side over there is a series called Extra, and that's a piece that I made on the set of Generations. And already then, when I made that work in 2011, I was very aware of my position as a kind of insider-outsider, still very much identifying myself as South African, carrying my shitty South African passport with me around the world, getting visas wherever I go, but nevertheless not necessarily being viewed or perceived as South African anymore in the South African context. And so with Extra, I very much thought of myself as an alien parachuting in, an extraterrestrial, parachuting not only as a white South African into a fictional black South African world, but parachuting as as an alien of sorts. That seems to work. As an alien of sorts, parachuting out of European context into South African context, which I like to think I understand, but which of course I no longer have a daily lived experience of.
It's funny, the first time I saw those works, I was still in undergrad and university. And it's interesting because now I'm remembering that the conversations I had about that work then are very similar to the conversations that I'm having with my friends with this work. And I guess it was more about, I think it's very easy to kind of muddy the intention of a work, which is to say that the thing, how do I say this? Basically the thing gets confused with the thing that you're mocking, right? Satire can be kind of tricky. And I thought it's funny because here's this white woman inserting herself into something black, as white people want to do sometimes. And so I kind of just oh, that makes sense. But everyone was like, okay, but why is she doing that? Because, as you say, reperpetrating the violence. But I think that when you talk about being an outsider, it's funny because as a person who was in love with English literature and was reading Henry James or whatever, it's always having that feeling and trying to kind of dissemble something and think about the places where it's racist and the places where it applies to you, which is a very kind of tricky kind of bomb detonating exercise, right? And I think that's why I find this video so interesting, because it kind of does that work for you on some level. It kind of makes it very obvious to you and kind of helps you try and detonate that bomb. Whether you're willing to do the extra steps, I guess, is up to you. But yeah, I mean, I think that thinking about white supremacy in general is constantly interesting to me because it's kind of is in everything that we do at all times, right? It's in the contemporary art that we look at, in the form of the spaces that we're in the books that we read, in the way that things are presented to us on a constant basis. And so, as you say, it's we deal with this shit all the time. It never kind of bugs me in that sense. I'm just oh, finally somebody's acknowledging it, so I don't have to.
Well, I think that deniability is a big part of the kind of operation of whiteness. And
Subtlety, yeah.
deniability, no, I didn't mean it that way. Oh, that's just the way he is. Oh, why are you so touchy? Why are you so sensitive? Why do you respond to everything in such a... And I think that both of these pieces, although they're very different, are interested in trying to expose the operating system. What are the kind of, the sort of underlying machineries of whiteness? And so for me, my presence both in Extra and in this work, I don't really think of myself as being a person or a character, but rather as an avatar for whiteness. And with Extra, the idea was to somehow make physical, undeniable, literal, obvious, the ways in which whiteness distracts, obfuscates, places itself at the center of attention, gets in the way without necessarily contributing, appropriates the labor of others, right? Because here you have like a whole team of actors working on set telling a story, but who's sucking up all the attention and who's, the most visibly present? Whitey. And so in a way, these pieces are deeply connected, and it's fun to look back a decade later at that work in the context of this work, yeah.
I was also interested in the kind of horror movie-esque kind of feeling of the piece. By the way, what's that very dramatic news music in between the cuts? Is that from a particular source?
The kind of boom.
Boom, boom, yeah.
That comes from one of those deeply neo-Nazi
I think it's like
videos.
Tucker Carlson or something. I feel like I've heard it before.
It's from one of those really, the ones that you really have to dig deep for. There's sort of alt-right videos which are basically seeking to deny harbor to refugees and migrants, and they, of course, always cast this dystopian myth of like what would happen if we let people in. Yeah.
And again, the extinction myth was kind of, it's funny, I was reading this article by Noam Chomsky the other day, but he said something like, it's so comic but also so tragic, and it was in reference to something completely different, but I think that's what this kind of strikes the heart of. And it also kind of reminded me of the experience of watching a movie like Get Out, kind of like this kind of like exaggerating things so that it's very clear like who the villain is on some level. And just like using the motifs of like this fear and this, I think that it's really interesting, especially because of the kind of people who see whiteness as inherently being more beautiful or more cultured. Western culture was like a really, oh yes, they do say that, don't they? Kind of moment as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, we're getting the
5 minutes.
5 minutes. I suppose that ultimately I was really interested in whether a piece like this, to come back to something that you said earlier, could reverse some of the relations of viewing, because I think that the direction of viewing and the direction of sight has always been, historically, white people looking at and othering people who are not white and studying them ethnographically, putting them under the microscope, displaying them, putting them on view. And so I think about the work as being autoethnographic, sort of looking at my people, which is why I'm there. I mean, it's important to me not to separate myself.
I think that was also something that I thought was really sensitive and smart of you, was to be the person saying these words in order to not cast yourself as this external person casting judgment, rather being somebody who's inside of something, acknowledging that you're inside of it, but also pointing to its extremeness and its ugliness.
Well, I've heard friends say often enough, that it's not the neo-Nazis and the alt-right people who are scary, because you can recognize them, you can avoid them, they're dangerous. It's the good whites that can be really scary, because there's a kind of pretense at having left racism behind, and that makes it much more sneaky and much more dark and slippery.
And that's why I use the term sea lining, right? Because it's like this constant ability to appear to be very polite, and I'm just asking. I don't know why you're getting so upset with me for just asking a question, but it's like this kind of understated thing where they know they're not the first person to ask you this question, but I'm just asking. I'm being so polite. Why are you getting frustrated? Why are you getting offended? And I think that's also partly, it's something that's historical in the way that we debate each other, right? It's prioritizing politeness at all times. And so it's being able to say, like, we're polite. They are not polite. And it's kind of just another microaggression, essentially, but kind of the constant desire, like need to have to say things as gently as possible. And I think that's partly why it's so important that you be the one that make this work, because you are not policed by the same kind of obligation of politeness, still are as a woman, of course, but to a lesser extent than the policing that happens of the, oh, you're articulate, and oh, you're so polite, and oh, that constant experience.
English so well, Khanya.
Oh, you'd almost think it was my first language.
No, but I think that's why it was really, I think it would have been kind of boring and predictable if the work only covered the very extreme voices, the alt-right propaganda, the neo-Nazis. For me, what became clear in the archive, because the work actually started accidentally, I've just kind of developed, I have all of these archives of video footage. I have dozens of archives, and I watch much too much video. I spend much too much time online, and whenever I find a schnipsel, a little piece of footage that's interesting, I file it somewhere. So one of my archives is called White People Talking About Race. And it's just been an amusing thing for me over the years, over the last decade, when I find a funny piece of footage, to throw it into the White People Talking About Race footage. And I didn't really have a purpose for that. But what became interesting about the exercise was I realized that what was almost more interesting than the hardcore Trump voices or the hardcore AfriForum voices was the daily racism, everyday racism, the good white people, what they say when they think that they're on the right side and they're kind of cozying up and expressing their alliedom.
It's funny that you said this as well, because it made me, I've been telling my friends, oh, this is perfect because whiteness is my research interest. Like, I've been doing the same thing, which is just like watching these videos and being like, that is so nuts. And then having to try and tell my friends about it, and they'd be like, we don't want to hear about this. Like thinking about like Nazi font and like all of the like weird like terms that people use to say things, because it is fascinating in any situation where any amount of people, especially this amount of people, are able to be so far away from each other and still have exactly the same words coming out of their mouth as if they were like robots who've been programmed. And I think that's partly why I'm so interested in like the ability of the internet and the algorithms and all those things. And I think what's interesting is that this can be applied to other belief systems, right? It doesn't just have to be about whiteness. It can be about any kind of argument or conversation that's polarizing. It often all goes back to whiteness, but there's just in terms of how we talk to each other and how we have conversations, the ability to disregard other people's points of view and perspectives by just using these easily cannibal kind of scripted lines. So when they say this, you say this, and when they say that, then you say this. Just like programming.
And it almost becomes script-like, which is why I think it lends itself very nicely to becoming a script. And that's how I really arrived at the white mantras, because I realized in the making of the piece, I'm sure that anyone here who's involved in production or who's been on a set of any kind will realize that in order to get the sync in the big video, I had to repeat each of these lines over and over and over again. So I was stood in front of a camera, and we would have the original voice running in the room, and I would say, I don't see color, I don't see color, I don't see color, I don't see color, I don't see color. And hoping that if I did 300, that one would not only sync perfectly, but would also have an interesting kind of thing going on. And in the process, it occurred to me that what was interesting about that as the kind of technical basis of the work was that actually socially this is how ideas get reinforced and repeated. We hear our parents or our family sort of saying things over and over again, and we absorb it, and then we move into the social realm and we have people repeating things and we internalize them, and that becomes our system of values and beliefs. So the white mantras is the title of the smaller pieces, and they actually reveal how the work was made in the sense that if you pay close attention, you'll see that these are not repeating. This is me trying to get on in time with the voice, and sometimes I fail and sometimes I don't, but for me what's important about it is how that repetition starts to turn things into truth. Through repeating things over and over again, this is how we start to believe that we have arrived at our truth, right? And of course that's very dangerous.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
Okay.
I'm going to keep talking to you about it. Sorry? Oh, questions, yeah, go on.
Yeah, questions, sure.
Okay, so thank you so much, Khanya and Candice. So we have a few minutes for questions, and I'm sure there are lots as the talk was extremely evocative. Could you just put your hand up if you have anything? Yeah. Start with that. I'm going to have to navigate to find you.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. So I was wondering, in this very sort of complex operation of reproducibility and appropriation that you're exploring here, reproduction and appropriation, whether you felt vulnerable at all in the making of this work.
I wanted to dig a hole and bury myself while I was making this work. I stood on the set for 10 days and had this poison flowing through me on set. It wasn't fun, but I just thought of it as my penance, right? For all of the benefits of being a white South African. It seemed like the least I could do. It was reparations, exactly, the least that I could do. But it was an extremely uncomfortable work to make. But obviously a level of discomfort which really has no relationship to the real discomfort of being having to deal with racism on an everyday basis. And I mean, certainly I think that as a white South African, as I always say when I speak to German friends, it's just not something that goes away. I mean, if you are a thinking German person, then you're completely haunted by the Holocaust still. And then, of course, there are many German people who sort of say, why do we still have to talk about the Holocaust? Isn't it history now? It's so boring. That was our grandparents. It's not our problem anymore. But if you are a thinking South African, then we know how close we are to this history. And those of us who carry the privileges and benefits need to still be thinking about and processing. And so for me, this was part of my ongoing processing of what it means to be born a perpetrator or to be born into a perpetrator class, as all of us were, all of us who happen to be white South Africans. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the specific role of gender and womanhood in this work as well. Like, obviously, we know that white womanhood is a specific brand of whiteness. So if you could just speak about that a little bit.
Well, I will tell you that in order to shoot and edit this work, we had to find a language for the wigs, because you couldn't just say, pass me the blonde wig. So all of the wigs have names, and that one on the far left, the name of that wig is Karen. So that should help to sort of give you a point of entry into... Exactly. So I wanted to, it would have been very easy, of course, to focus on white men, and there is a nice little section of the work that has a good go at white men. But of course, we know that white women are the handmaidens of white men and have benefited very nicely by sort of being beholden to and being a part of white supremacist structures. And for me, what's really important is to sort of think about these things intersectionally. Obviously, in South Africa, we need to and will continue to be haunted predominantly and primarily by race for some time to come. But we do, of course, need to pass the difference. What does it mean to be a black woman versus being a black man in this country? How has that, sort of resonated historically and in the present? And so I decided that I needed to sort of move around between these voices that are gendered in different ways in order to try and cover the range. And in particular, there are certain voices in there that are specifically attempts to blend feminism and racism. This is very common on the alt-right. Yeah. So it's like we're so worried about our white babies, and you know, and we're such good mothers and we're such good feminists, and that's the only reason why we're racist. And I think that kind of layer of the piece comes out in particular when they're talking about the demographics, and it's always this kind of use of one's womanhood as a defense for one's racism. I'm just doing it to protect my family, to protect my altruism, maternal altruism as a means of defense, but also, of course, always that underlying kind of notion that the white woman is always the kind of excuse for racism, right? Because it's always about protecting the white woman against the sort of primitive instincts of the black man. This is at the core of every racist ideology. And so I hope that the specificity of the role that white women play in kind of holding that ideology together can be felt in the piece through the kinds of female voices. What's really interesting in the alt-right, for those of you who don't spend all your time watching right-wing videos online, is that the dominant voices in all of these alt-right and neo-Nazi movements are still men, and the women are still expected to play second fiddle. And the way that that's been interpreted by the women is that there's a word for it, they call themselves trad wives, which means traditional wives. And the notion is that your role, if you want to be a good racist right-wing woman, is that you've got to go out of your way to protect all those old-fashioned 50s domestic values and bring up the kids so that they're prepared to deal with you know, all of that reverse racism and all of that. Exactly, Nazi Barbie. And Nazi Barbies are really a thing. And but I'm thankful to you for asking the question, because of course at the beginning the temptation would be to focus on white men. But for me it was important to also embed myself in the work. And so obviously I had to deal with the gender aspect of it. I don't know if that comes across. I mean, the work is still kind of fresh for me, so I'm still at the point where I'm gathering responses and trying to understand how other people receive the work. You have such fixed ideas in your head when you're editing, and you have to have fixed ideas in order to find your way through an edit. But the really interesting part happens when the work is in the world and you start hearing how other people perceive it. And with a work like this, of course, that's going to mean quite a vast range of responses. Yeah.
So you mentioned that one is called Karen?
Yeah.
All right. So I can't help but ask you then, what are those?
Oh, you want to know the names of all the wigs?
I think we all do.
Okay. But let's see if I can remember. So that.
I actually have a serious question after this, I'm sorry, but
okay.
that was...
Okay. Okay, so that's Kylie on the far left. This is Disney. This is Ellen. This is Medusa. That one in the middle, you know. This one was called Jonathan. It's a bit of a dig at a friend of mine who you'll never meet. That's Brittany. The very Nazi-ish wig. What is the night in my head? She's the Nazis, and I'm trying to remember what her wig name was. And on the far right is Karen. I'm remembering 8 out of 9. Who was that? That one was called... All family. Oh, it's all in the family, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, shit.
Go for it.
Hi, Candice. I just wanted to say that I really admire you greatly. Seeing the extra really just sort of put everything together. But I want to talk about the TikTok thing and what I saw when I looked at the video. I thought about the tech class in America as Facebook, Instagram began to sort of like put out the algorithms. And this was white-controlled tech companies. And so it's so interesting when you say TikTok, because it's actually a Chinese company. And we saw the American government push back against TikTok. And so as we enter the Asian century, I think it's quite interesting the way you speak of the issue around white supremacy, but in fact the power is shifting and TikTok becomes representative of that movement of power towards Asia.
Yeah, it's a really nice observation. I mean, I think that that's absolutely true, but I think in terms of the sort of daily usage of these social platforms, the interesting thing is that depending on what ideological milieu you're in, people use them for their own purposes and to reproduce their own messaging. But of course, TikTok may not be a thing for much longer in kind of Western countries. It's taking a lot of flack. Of course.
Yeah. I think what's also interesting as well is that part of this whole technocratic kind of phase that we're in is the insistence on non-bias or neutrality. And so when you receive that kind of information that like relies on white supremacist beliefs that are already existing, even if there's not a person behind the computer make a particular choice, it entrenches existing beliefs and sticks you into that corner so that you continue to receive that same information. Just like my TikTok looks very different to yours. It doesn't really matter what country it's from in this end of the day, because it's like they're appealing to the sense of neutrality and this idea that they're not beholden to anybody because we didn't make the decision, the computer made the decision. And that's how we continue to live in like a world that prioritizes capitalism or prioritizes whiteness or prioritizes the patriarchy. That's how you get a person like Andrew Tate in the 21st century. It's because these very neutral platforms don't have any kind of sieve to like stop you from receiving, okay, you've seen too much misogynistic crap today, so we're going to like wean you off. It just allows you to just revel in that information. And I think that's also what's interesting. America pointing to TikTok as being this villain when companies like Google and Facebook and Instagram and Facebook especially has been proven to be doing that same thing constantly with less neutrality, intentionally serving people particular political information. So it's not, it's basically being like, well, we're not racist, the computer is racist in a way. I think that's just interesting.
And I mean, just to sort of build on that, I think what is so interesting is the way that the technology that human beings create carries the biases of those human beings. So I know that Broomberg and Shanaran have made some very interesting work about the sort of way that photography has been developed so that the white skin will look good on film and black skin falls into shadow. Or I know that when they started in taps in bathrooms, these taps where you put your hands underneath to start the tap running, when they invented those systems at the beginning, they only tested them on fair skin. So, in the US, they found very, very quickly that people of color couldn't use these taps because the reading mechanism was designed to be responsive. And of course, it's not only with race that this bias happens. With the crash test dummies, that was an interesting example recently. That crash test dummies are really designed based on the specifics of male bodies. So women are far less safe, even in all of these fancy, expensive cars, than men are, because the way that female bodies are built hasn't really been taken into consideration in the building of these crash test dummies, which of course are the prototypes for our human bodies. And so they're now starting to completely rethink what a crash test dummy, dummy, anyway, you get the point. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh. Last question.
Candice, can I ask you maybe a little bit of a naughty question? I was wondering about the effect of the over-the-topness and the drama and so on. Obviously, that alerts viewers who might not be that switched on that there is something going on here. But there's maybe a danger that for white people who do think of themselves as good whites, who don't necessarily say most of those things or think they don't, that it's then comforting. It removes you from being implicated, or there's a danger of being of experiencing the work as not implicating you personally. Yeah. So I was wondering if you had thought about that.
Yeah, I worry about it. And again, I'm not sure if I caught the curve and if I got it right. I tried to feed in enough of that very, very subtle daily stuff so that the good whites, I'm a good white person, so that the good whites would see themselves in there as well, because sometimes it can be so very subtle. I mean, I've asked myself, and I'm still asking myself, about the role that the theatricality and the humor plays in the work. And I think I think that the humor is important because I do want the absurdity to be transported, but I also wanted things to be quite theatrical because I wanted the whiteness to resonate as something which is a political construct. I mean, we all know, or we all should know by now, that race is a completely invented thing, and it's so easy to kind of pretend that whiteness is just a natural state of being, as you said earlier, a sort of normative condition. And I had kind of hoped that the sort of exaggerated performance would draw attention to the constructed nature of race. But I do think that I'm very curious to hear how people feel the work, because I hope that I've done enough to make it uncomfortable, even for the good whites. But I'm not sure. So we're going to have to see, as the work finds its way into the world, whether the good whites are now feeling extra good when they walk out of the work, or whether they're feeling a little bit a little bit cringy, you know. The jury is still out. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Candice and Khanya, for the talk, and thank you everybody for coming. I would invite those who have not seen the room next door to see it or revisit it after the talk, as lots of new ideas have come up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Khanya. Thank you.